When my mission from the system finally wrapped up, I made the choice to stay behind for her. It was only after her first love returned from abroad after a decade that I realized my supposed redemption of her soul was nothing more than a pathetic delusion. My name is Lucas, and I spent 5 years in this world acting as Olivia's guardian angel. I taught her how to value herself and gave her back her dignity, transforming her from a desperate sycophant into a confident woman of power. Yet the moment that man beckoned, she would still sneak out at midnight, returning home reeking of cheap booze and some other guy's cologne. She would look at me with a gaze like ice and snap that I was just a hired hand who had no right to question her life. She had no idea that this body of mine was merely a temporary vessel constructed by the system. As a falling planter struck me right in front of her, and my consciousness began drifting back to my real body as a billionaire, the last thing I heard was the sound of her frantic screaming. Honestly, I didn't care anymore. After all, the real Lucas Croft was finally preparing to wake up in the real world. My directive from the system was simple. Redeem the obsessive supporting character, teach her the value of self-respect, marry her, and choose to remain in this world for her sake. I followed that path faithfully until the man she had been obsessed with for years moved back to the city. That was the moment she began slipping out of the house in the dead of night. She would return home with the stench of cheap alcohol clinging to her clothes. When I finally asked her where she had been, tried to keep my voice gentle and filled with concern, she couldn't even look me in the eye. Her patience shattered instantly. She told me that I was only there to be her companion and nothing more, demanding to know why I felt the need to interfere in her business. I stood there frozen, certain I had misheard her. Olivia must have realized how cruel she sounded because her face immediately softened, shifting back into that gentle expression I had grown to love over the years. She told me she didn't mean it that way, insisting that I didn't need to worry because her love for me was permanent. She moved toward me and hooked her arm through mine, using that familiar, manipulative way she had of smoothing things over. But at that moment, the smell of old smoke and booze was overpowered by a sharp, expensive male cologne that hit me like a physical blow. I flinched and pulled my arm away, stepping back as I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 1 a.m, and the silence in the room felt heavy. I asked her who could have possibly called her so late that she had to rush out of the house. My voice was devoid of emotion. Her expression turned cold again as she claimed it was just a friend, questioning why I was suddenly interrogating her. She told me that if I was going to act this way, she would just sleep in the guest room. She threw open the bedroom door with a violent jerk. She stopped at the doorway and looked back at me, saying she couldn't believe that after all our time together, I still didn't trust her. She said I didn't trust our relationship and expressed how disappointed she was, claiming that I was the one who had changed. She slammed the door, leaving me sitting alone on the edge of our bed. I wondered if I really was the one who had changed, or if it was her all along. We had been a couple for such a long time that I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe it really was just a friend in need. I knew the reality of being an heiress to the Vance family meant she had a massive social circle filled with people who lived for the nightlife. She had distanced herself from that crowd after we started dating, mostly because I had to drag her out of clubs too many times in the beginning. I remembered how I used to clean her up while frowning in disgust. She knew how much I loathed the smell of those places and had promised me she was done with that life. It had been years since then, and I tried to tell myself she had just forgotten her promise. I knew I was lying to myself, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I kept hoping that I was just overcomplicating things in my own head. Before I could even pull back the covers, I heard a commotion coming from the foyer. It was Olivia, and she was on the phone again. She was telling someone that it was fine if they lost their key card and that she was coming to help right that second. Her voice sounded panicked and hurried. Then I heard the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut. I rubbed my temples as a wave of pure exhaustion crashed over me. That was the second time she had ditched me that night. I lay back and squeezed my eyes shut, desperately trying to turn off my brain. My mind remained painfully awake, and a few minutes later, I heard the front door creak open and click shut very quietly. My heart hammered against my ribs. I heard Olivia whisper to someone to be quiet so they wouldn't wake up Lucas. She told the person that they hadn't showered and reminded them that I hated the smell of cigarettes and liquor. She warned them that I would throw them out if I caught them. She was definitely not alone. A man's voice replied, teasing her about how thrilling it was to be sneaking around like this. He joked that it felt like a real affair, with the wife sneaking her lover into the house while the husband was supposedly dead to the world. I tried to ignore the disgusting implication and focused solely on the voice. It was a voice I knew all too well, Caleb Winters. Of course, the original protagonist of this world was back. Olivia giggled in a shy, flirtatious way as she engaged in playful banter with him. She clearly knew how much I despised that smell, and she knew no husband would tolerate his wife bringing another man home at this hour. Yet there she was, bringing Caleb into our home while they both stank of the club. Any warmth I had left for her turned to ice. I listened as their muffled footsteps moved toward the guest room further down the hallway. Caleb playfully protested that she shouldn't go in there since that was where he would be staying for the night. He asked if she wasn't going to sleep in the master bedroom, and she replied that she couldn't because he had made her smell like a bar. She told him he could have the couch, but needed to be gone by sunrise, promising to help him find an apartment the next day. He mockingly asked if she was really going to refuse to let him warm up her bed, calling her behavior a bit cold. He reminded her that she used to beg for his attention, practically crawling after him. His voice was thick with a level of contempt that showed he had zero respect for her. He sneered that since Chloe didn't want him anymore, she had finally gotten her wish. He told her to get a move on. I heard the sound of a brief, half-hearted struggle before the guest room door finally clicked shut. My stomach turned in knots. In the original story, Olivia Vance was pathetically obsessed with Caleb Winters, acting as a doormat he could trample whenever he pleased. She was supposed to be a glamorous, stunning heiress who possessed her own sense of pride and dignity. I had spent years working to show her what a healthy, equal relationship looked like, trying to restore her self-respect. But the second he reappeared, it was as if all my hard work and devotion had simply evaporated into thin air. She had immediately reverted to being his shameless follower. A bitter, self-deprecating smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. I had been such a fool for so long. In the beginning, I was nothing more than a background character in the narrative of this world. I was an orphan who had fallen into a coma after a horrific car crash. The system had manufactured this new identity for me to inhabit. My task was to get close to Olivia and prevent her from sabotaging the relationship between the story's main couple. Once that objective was achieved, I was supposed to return to my real body and wake up from my coma. I had visited that hospital once and seen my actual body lying in a bed, covered in tubes and wires while machines kept me alive. I rarely went back there, and I made sure my medical bills were paid automatically from my personal accounts. I had convinced myself that staying here with Olivia was the better choice because I loved her and I genuinely believed she felt the same. I didn't want to be alone anymore, so when the system notified me of my success, I made the choice to stay. The system warned me repeatedly that this was a mistake, but I refused to listen. Eventually, it severed our connection and departed from this world. Olivia and I were together for years, though we kept our relationship a secret because of my fabricated background. We were happy back then. She managed a booming entertainment empire, while I became a highly sought-after songwriter. I spent my days writing hits for her roster of artists. She wasn't supposed to be that desperate girl from the original story anymore. I tried to comfort myself with the thought that she just felt sorry for Caleb. After all, she had carried a torch for him for a decade. Now that he was back and struggling, her old feelings were probably just manifesting as pity. Maybe he really was just a friend like she claimed, and this whole situation would eventually just blow over. I woke up early the next morning, determined to confront both of them and lay all the cards on the table. Just as I reached for the bedroom doorknob, I heard the sound of quiet, hurried movement coming from the hall. Olivia told him to hurry up before I found out, and Caleb mockingly asked if she meant me finding out about their shady little arrangement. She told him to stop it while giggling, urging him to leave because they had plans for later that day. My hand fell from the door. I felt a crushing sense of disappointment. If they were truly just friends, there would be no need for all this lying and sneaking around. They were acting like a couple of criminals. I knew then that this had to end, and that walking away was my only option. I got dressed and prepared for a business meeting. I decided that as soon as I returned, I would tell her that I wanted a divorce. Prolonging this relationship any further would only be a form of torture for her and a source of constant humiliation for me. I pulled up to the skyscraper that served as the headquarters for Vance Entertainment. I had a meeting scheduled with one of their top talent agents. They were looking for new material for a fresh artist they were promoting. I made my way toward the rehearsal studios. I wanted to see what this new talent could do. But as I looked across the hall, I saw Olivia walking arm in arm with Caleb Winters. They were laughing together as they walked through the office and vanished into a waiting elevator. I was there to work with her company, yet here she was openly flirting with another man right in the middle of her place of business. An assistant waved me over from the entrance, calling out my name to get my attention. I forced down the bitterness rising in my throat and followed the assistant. The agent eventually led us into the rehearsal space. He peered through the glass panel of the studio door and looked surprised for a fleeting second before masking it with a practiced, professional smile. He told me that their CEO was taking a personal interest in the project and was actually inside the room. A terrible realization began to dawn on me. A moment later, the door opened and I was standing face to face with two people I knew very well. The agent gave a respectful nod and told Ms. Vance what a pleasant surprise it was to see her there. He then introduced me as the hit songwriter they had been so eager to sign for the project, referring to me as Lucas Croft. He mentioned he hadn't had the chance to confirm my involvement yet. A loud ringing started in my ears, making his voice fade into the background. All I could focus on was the scene in front of me. Caleb was the new talent, and Olivia, the CEO, was there to personally oversee his debut. I clenched my fists, so hard my nails dug into my palms as I struggled to remain composed. Olivia's eyes went wide with shock for a brief moment. She quickly regained her composure and put on a mask of professional neutrality, acting as if she had never seen me before in her life. Caleb, however, dropped his usual arrogant attitude and gave me a smile that was thick with smug satisfaction. He bragged that he and Olivia had a long history, mentioning that she was the one who had funded his scholarship to Juilliard years ago. He claimed they had stayed in close contact while he was in New York. He didn't realize who I was personally, only that I was the writer the company was courting. He turned his attention to me and said that Olivia had been keeping him informed about the local music industry long before his return. He went on about how she already had an agent and a contract waiting for him, really piling on the arrogance. He was clearly trying to show off his influence with the CEO, hoping to pressure me into signing onto the project. The more he rambled, the more I found myself smiling. Olivia noticed my expression and nervously pulled on his sleeve. She told him that was enough and insisted that we focus on the business at hand instead of getting distracted. The agent let out a nervous laugh to ease the tension, remarking on how close Ms. Vance and Caleb seemed to be. He asked for my thoughts on the collaboration. I simply smiled and agreed that they seemed very close indeed. I remarked that it certainly found himself a perfect meal ticket, calling him a very rare kind of talent. Caleb's expression soured as he asked if I was just jealous that he had such a powerful benefactor supporting him while I didn't. He said that opportunities like this were hard to come by and that it was only natural for us not to share the same level of connection. The agent looked horrified and clearly wanted to silence Caleb, but he didn't have the nerve to do it with Olivia standing right there. He settled for giving the guy a warning look, but Caleb was so used to being pampered by Olivia that he didn't care. My tiny bit of baiting was all it took to make him lose his composure completely. I laughed and told him he was right, noting that the person who was supposed to be my support was currently busy acting as a stepping stone for someone else. I kept my eyes locked on Olivia. She looked panicked and tightened her grip on Caleb's arm. She barked at us to stop and demanded that we return to the details of the project immediately. The agent finally realized that something was seriously wrong and kept looking back and forth between the three of us. Everyone present was smart enough to figure out the subtext. The mood in the room shifted as people began exchanging knowing looks. Olivia's face turned bright red with embarrassment. She tried to walk away, but Caleb wouldn't let go of her. I let out a mocking sound and turned to leave. She called out after me, claiming that she only admired his musical ability and nothing more. I didn't even turn around, just gave her a dismissive wave of my hand to show I didn't care. I told her to find someone else to write for him because I was done. I felt like a complete idiot for ever trusting her. I had actually tried to find excuses for her behavior, but it was clear now that this wasn't about pity. She had been obsessed with him the whole time. Even during the times when our relationship seemed perfect, she had never truly severed her ties with him. I began to doubt if there had ever been any real love between us from the very beginning. I saw my reflection in a glass window as I walked away and realized I looked like a total mess. I was wearing a smile, but it looked far more heartbreaking than if I had been in tears. The rehearsal rooms were on one of the top floors. I shoved open the fire exit door and started heading down the stairs. I heard the sound of frantic footsteps behind me as Olivia chased after me, calling out my name. I looked down at her high heels and thought about how much effort she was putting in for Caleb's sake, considering she was running downstairs in them. I stopped and turned around to look at her. She was leaning against the railing, struggling to catch her breath. She begged me not to get the wrong idea, swearing that there was nothing going on between her and Caleb and that they were just old friends. I raised my hand to cut her off and told her that she didn't owe me any explanations because it wouldn't change anything. I told her that her actions had already spoken much louder than any words she could say. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairwell with a sneer on his face, mockingly calling me a great hitmaker with a voice full of disdain. He laughed at my inability to keep my woman, then added that he supposed he couldn't really blame me for it. He reminded me that back when Olivia was following him around like a pathetic groupie, I was probably just some nobody in a corner of the world he didn't care about. His words hit me like a physical punch. I looked at Olivia, expecting to see her looking ashamed or angry at his comment. But she didn't look humiliated at all. Instead, her ears turned slightly red, and she looked embarrassed in a shy, girlish way. I let out a dry, hollow laugh and admitted that he was absolutely right about everything. I told him that he was welcome to her, and then turned my gaze back toward Olivia one last time. I told her I would be waiting at the house at 7 o'clock that evening, so we could discuss the terms of our divorce. She went completely still, the color draining from her face as she asked me to repeat what I had just said. I knew she had heard me perfectly well. She was just in shock. I decided I didn't have anything else to say to her. I turned around and walked away. The first thing I did was call my lawyer and tell him to draft the divorce agreement. I spent that evening waiting in the living room, but the only thing I received was a phone call from her. She told me flat out that she wasn't going to get a divorce and that her decision was final. She repeated her claim that there was nothing going on with Caleb and told me to stop being so paranoid about their friendship. The background noise was deafening. I could hear people cheering and music blasting, the unmistakable sounds of a crowded nightclub. I could hear Caleb's voice in the distance as well. She was out with him once again. I told her quietly that since he was trying to start a career, being spotted at a club probably wasn't the best PR move for him. She brushed me off and said she would take care of it, telling me it was none of my concern. She told me my only job was to write his music, but I immediately informed her that wasn't going to happen. I ended the call with a cold tone. I had already made it clear to the agency that morning that I was passing on the project. Even so, she was still trying to force me to do it for his benefit, completely disregarding how I felt about the situation. It was obvious that she would always pick him over me. I felt a sense of exhaustion that seemed to reach all the way into my bones. I fell onto the bed and eventually sank into a heavy, restless sleep. My phone started ringing early the next morning. It was my assistant calling to ask if I was really serious about turning down the collaboration project. When I confirmed I wasn't doing it, he sounded relieved. He started to say he was worried about something, but then cut himself off. I asked him what he was afraid of. Sleeping hadn't helped at all. My head was throbbing, and I felt like I was running a fever. I told him to just say what was on his mind. He finally decided to send me something, telling me I needed to see it for myself. He hung up, and a second later, a notification popped up on my screen with a photo attachment. It was nearly lunchtime by the time Olivia finally showed up, smelling like she had been swimming in a vat of beer. She spoke to me in a patronizing tone, saying she had given me the whole night to think and asking if I had finally come to my senses. She really had the nerve to believe that ignoring me for the night was some kind of favor to help me reflect. I pressed my palm against my forehead to dull the pain and managed to give her a weak, forced smile. I told her very clearly and slowly that I wanted to end our marriage. She didn't even seem to notice that I looked ill. Her expression just darkened with anger. She repeated that she wasn't getting a divorce and insisted that she and Caleb were simply old friends catching up after a long time. She argued that since he had just moved back and didn't have a job, it was only natural for her to help him out a bit. She asked why I couldn't just trust her and claimed I was overthinking the whole thing before letting out a dramatic sigh. She acted as if I were a massive disappointment to her. I held up my phone, my weak smile shifting into a cold, hard smirk. The photo my assistant sent was of them in a booth at a club. Olivia was wrapped around Caleb in a very intimate embrace. Her eyes were full of love for him, and her lips were only inches away from his neck. I asked her if friends usually looked like they were about to make out. I had taken some medicine, but I still felt like I was dying. While I felt miserable, she looked like she was having the best time ever. Olivia went completely still. She stammered that it wasn't what it looked like and claimed she had just had too much to drink while he was leading her on. She reminded me of how he could be and insisted that as soon as she launched his career, things would change. She promised to hand his management over to an agent so she wouldn't have to deal with him directly anymore. She asked me for just a few more days and sat down beside me, grabbing my arm with a pleading smile on her face. She insisted that divorce wasn't an option because we had promised to never leave one another. I gave her a cold look and reminded her that she had also promised never to set foot in a nightclub again. I suggested that since we were both so prone to forgetting our promises, it would be better if we just went our separate ways. Olivia shoved my arm away in anger and complained that she was trying to be nice, but I was refusing to listen to reason. She told me not to forget that I only existed in this world because of her and that she was the sole reason I was still here. She asked where I would even go without her, a cruel and confident smile spreading across her features. She told me that I had no one else in this world but her and that I was essentially trapped by her side whether I liked it or not. I looked at her and saw that she was completely calm. It was terrifyingly clear that she meant every single word she said. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that this was how she truly viewed me and our relationship. Having the truth laid bare like that felt like a massive hand was crushing my chest, making it difficult for me to catch my breath. However, she was wrong about one very important detail. I wasn't actually trapped in this world with her. I had never revealed to her that I was originally from her own world. I knew that if this body suffered a major physical trauma, my consciousness would begin the process of transferring back to my actual body in the hospital, and I would finally wake up. This temporary body would die and become nothing more than a shell. To start that process, I needed to put myself into a near-death state. The more fragile this body became, the quicker the transfer would occur. My memories would travel along with my consciousness. While I still had my wits about me, I went ahead and transferred all my accumulated assets into my real-world bank accounts. I had no intention of letting my hard-earned success vanish. I instructed my assistant to stop taking on any new work. I told him to start closing out all our active projects. He looked completely confused by my instructions. He asked if I was retiring, and I took a moment before nodding and telling him it was something along those lines. I advised him to start looking for a new job, assuring him he would be free to move on once we finished our current obligations. He looked genuinely upset and told me I was the best boss he'd ever had. I just gave him a small smile in return. He was a great assistant, and I planned to make sure he was taken care of financially, but every chapter eventually has to close. Once my affairs were in order, I began considering how to experience a near-death moment without actually ending my life permanently. I couldn't afford to die instantly because a transfer of that speed would likely destroy my mind. I put on a thin shirt and went for a walk in the biting cold of the autumn night. I figured if I caught a cold or developed a high fever, it would be a good starting point for weakening the body. Once I stopped revolving my entire life around Olivia, I finally began to notice the beauty of the world that surrounded me. I watched the leaves dancing on the pavement and felt like the old brick buildings and quiet alleys were filled with a deep sense of history. I wandered aimlessly, but the entire city suddenly felt much smaller than it ever had before. It felt small enough that I somehow ended up running into Olivia and Kayla Winters regardless of where I went. They were standing in a dark alleyway, deep in conversation. They were positioned close together, and the air around them was heavy with tension. I had no desire to interrupt them. Olivia had promised me she would take care of things with Caleb and stop seeing him. I couldn't imagine what kind of business she was handling with him in a dark alley at night. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the space. As I turned to walk away, I caught sight of a heavy planter on a second-story ledge that was wobbling dangerously in the wind. I was just about to yell for them to get out of the way when a much stronger wind gusted the building. The planter tipped over and plummeted toward them. In that heartbeat, my instincts simply took over. I threw myself forward and shoved Olivia out of the path of the falling object, but then all I felt was a heavy, sickening thud. I guess I really am a decent person after all. I woke up later with a pounding, dull ache in the middle of my forehead. The pungent smell of hospital disinfectant filled my nostrils as I stared up at the generic ceiling tiles above me. I realized I was in a hospital bed. Olivia rushed to my side, sounding relieved that I was finally awake and asking if I was in pain. Olivia hurried over to the bed, looking worried. I looked at her, completely confused, and asked her what she was doing there. I asked why I was in the hospital and tried to reach for my head, only to feel the thick layers of gauze covering a wound. I wanted to know what had happened to me. She hesitated for a moment and asked if I really didn't remember anything. I asked her what I was supposed to remember. She told me that I had saved her life the previous night when a planter fell and struck me instead. Her story was pretty vague and didn't provide many details, which only left me feeling more bewildered than before. I asked her why I would have saved her and how exactly I ended up being hit by a flower pot in the first place. Olivia looked at me with a very strange expression and asked if I truly had no memory of the event at all. She seemed shocked that I didn't remember saving her. I just stared back at her, feeling completely lost. I questioned why I would ever do such a thing, pointing out that we hadn't even seen each other in a very long time. I reminded her that she had been preoccupied with her new talent while I had been home by myself, so the idea of me saving her made no sense. Her face turned red with anger as if my words had really stung. She asked me if I really had to be so sarcastic right now. She insisted again that nothing was happening with Caleb and told me that my jealousy was getting completely out of hand. She accused me of faking memory loss, asking if the idea of saving her was so painful that I had to lie about it. I had a very vague, blurry memory of shoving someone out of danger, but I couldn't remember who they were or where the incident took place. I felt a sudden surge of joy. It meant the transfer of my consciousness had finally been triggered. My lips felt painfully chapped and dry, and my throat was raw with thirst. I tried to push myself up into a sitting position, but I was too weak. Given how angry Olivia looked, I didn't think she was in the mood to help me with a glass of water. It was too physically uncomfortable to keep talking, so I just stayed quiet. She clearly interpreted my silence as a form of defiance or stubbornness. She kept on ranting, throwing accusations and blame at me while I just watched her in silence. I expected to feel heartbroken, but I didn't feel much of anything. There was only a slight irritation at being misunderstood. She eventually stopped talking, and a look of panic crossed her face as she realized that I might not actually be faking my condition. A doctor walked in for his rounds at that exact moment, and she practically lunged at him, grabbing his arm. She frantically told the doctor that I couldn't remember how I got injured and asked if it was possible that I had amnesia. The doctor examined me briefly and noticed how dry and cracked my lips were. He gave her a stern look and asked how she was supposed to be looking after me, pointing out that I was clearly suffering from dehydration. He told her that it was obvious I could barely talk and ordered her to get me some water immediately. Olivia went quiet, her face flushed with shame as she brought me a cup of water and helped me sit up so I could drink. The doctor explained that there were no signs of brain bleeding and suggested that my memory loss was likely a psychological response. He said it was likely triggered by some kind of recent emotional trauma and that my memory might return if that issue was resolved. Olivia nodded along, listening intently to everything the doctor said, and then began pacing around the hospital room. She was talking to herself, trying to figure out what could have caused me such a shock. She reasoned that seeing her with Caleb must have broken my heart, and that Caleb's provocations had been too much for me to handle. It wasn't about any of that. It was the physical impact and the brush with death that had actually started the consciousness transfer. That was why I couldn't remember the accident itself. Eventually, Olivia brought me back home from the hospital. She seemed to be in high spirits and turned to smile at me while we were sitting at a red light. She told me that she had officially handed Caleb's career over to an agent and promised that they wouldn't have any more contact so I could stop worrying. She added that Caleb's first love was back in the city anyway, so he wouldn't be bothering her anymore regardless. So the story's actual leading lady had returned. I realized Caleb was probably busy pursuing her now. I remained silent, but Olivia was in such a good mood that she just kept talking throughout the drive. I used to think her talkative nature was charming, but now it just felt like irritating background noise. I couldn't understand why she was so happy when the man she had been obsessed with for years clearly didn't want her. It made no sense to me. I leaned my head against the car window and closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep to get some peace. I was hoping she would get the message, and she finally stopped talking. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The world felt quiet again. By the time we arrived home, Olivia seemed more excited than ever. She opened the front door and looked at me with a look that was both shy and expectant. I looked into the house and was confused to see the coffee table completely covered in rose petals arranged like a heart. Past the living room, I could see a single rose and a vase on the dining table, surrounded by lit candles. There were 2 plates with steaks and 2 glasses of wine ready. It looked like the ultimate romantic setup. I thank her for putting this together to celebrate my release from the hospital and meant it sincerely. The hopeful expression she had been wearing vanished for a moment before she forced a smile back onto her face. She told me it wasn't exactly for that, though I could consider it a part of the reason. I was lost. If it wasn't to celebrate me coming home from the hospital, I had no idea what the occasion was. She gave me a coy, playful look and told me to stop acting like I didn't know, adding that she wouldn't be mad if I hadn't bought a gift. She said she understood I had been in the hospital, but mentioned that she had gotten something for me regardless. I ran through all the dates in my head, but it wasn't a holiday, my birthday, or Valentine's Day. As I stood there trying to puzzle it out, her face began to harden. She asked me if I truly didn't remember what day it was. I sighed and asked her to stop making me guess because I genuinely had no clue. She looked devastated as she told me it was our wedding anniversary and asked how I could have possibly forgotten. She asked if my memory loss from the accident was responsible for me forgetting such an important day. She shook her head with tears in her eyes, insisting that it was impossible for me to forget our anniversary. She claimed I would never forget because I had always cared so much, and she mentioned the doctor's theory that I would only forget trivial things. I took a step away from her. The intensity in her eyes was starting to make me feel uneasy. She started shouting that I was lying to her and asked how our wedding anniversary could possibly be considered unimportant. She grabbed my shoulders and began to shake me violently. I just stood there and let her do it without saying a word. The trauma from the injury had clearly sped up the consciousness transfer. I truly had no memory of the date. Olivia was in total denial. She gave me a hard shove as she struggled to process what I was saying. She stormed out of the front door and slammed it behind her, looking completely devastated. Much later that night, Caleb showed up at the door, holding up a clearly intoxicated Olivia. He dumped her onto the couch with zero care and gave me a smug smirk. He claimed he had no idea he was still her emergency contact and said the bartender only called him because of that. He pretended to be annoyed, saying that he didn't even like her, but that she wouldn't stop pestering him. He said he only put up with her because she was his employer. I placed a hand over my heart. I felt like I should be experiencing some kind of deep pain or sadness, but there was absolutely nothing there. Not even a flicker of emotion crossed my mind. I just looked up at him and gave a flat response. My lack of a reaction seemed to irritate him. He sneered and asked why I was pretending to be so calm. He mocked me, saying that she followed him and I followed her, so I must be suffering internally. He told me I could be honest with him and even offered to stay away from her if it would make me feel better. I just shook my head. I told him that wasn't necessary and made it clear that I wasn't the kind of person to sacrifice my self-respect for love. I looked out the window and noticed that the weather was getting much colder as the night went on. I actually felt polite enough to suggest that he just stay the night in the guest room. I mentioned that he had stayed there before anyway. He looked at me like I had grown a second head. He was shocked that I knew about his previous stay. I told him very calmly that I had been well aware of it. It was a weird feeling. I remembered how knowing he was in our house had once kept me awake in total misery. Looking back on it now, I couldn't even begin to relate to the way I felt then. Caleb clearly thought I was just acting. He started heading toward the guest room, but stopped at the entrance to look back. He told me he was interested to see how long I could maintain the charade. I just shook my head, feeling tired of the whole situation. I turned my focus to Olivia, who was passed out on the couch and mumbling to herself. I had zero interest in trying to understand what she was saying. I couldn't believe my past self had ever put up with this. I didn't know how I had ever tolerated being around someone who smelled so strongly of smoke and booze. I had a memory of leaning in close to her in the past, trying to make out what she was saying when she was drunk. I realized then that nothing worth hearing ever comes from someone in that state. I must have been crazy to care so much. When she had been brought home, I had originally planned to wait 10 minutes before locking the door and going to bed. Since she was finally home, I just secured the house and went straight to my room to sleep. As I drifted off, I had a nagging feeling that I was forgetting something important. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, so I just decided to get some rest. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, having finally slept through the night for the first time in years. Olivia was sitting on the sofa, looking exhausted. As soon as she noticed me, she looked up quickly. She complained that I had left her on the couch all night. I asked her what she expected me to do, like give her a bath. I spoke with such total indifference that her eyes instantly began to well up with tears. She said I never used to act this way. I asked her what I was like before out of genuine curiosity, causing her to bite her lip. She listed all the things I used to do, like making her soup, massaging her head, and helping her get cleaned up and changed. She asked if I had forgotten all of that as well. I took a second to think, but I honestly couldn't recall doing any of it. Another night had passed, and more of my old memories had vanished. It felt like progress. Right then, the guest room door creaked open and a tired-looking Caleb walked out into the living area. Olivia jumped in surprise and then shot him a look of absolute loathing. She yelled at Caleb, blaming him for everything and claiming he was the reason I was traumatized. She screamed that his presence had caused me to forget our life together before stumbling toward him in an attempt to attack. She looked like she was trying to claw at him, but she was still drunk and unsteady on her feet, causing her to trip and fall flat on the floor. Caleb looked taken aback by her sudden aggression, but his face quickly hardened into an icy expression. He asked her how any of this was his fault, reminding her that she was the one who had let it happen and even encouraged it. Olivia tried to get back on her feet, but Caleb simply stepped over her and walked out of the house. She remained on the floor, looking like a total disaster. I felt a tiny spark of pity for her. It wasn't about love anymore. I just felt bad for a human being who was clearly struggling. Seeing her get humiliated by the man she loved was a sad sight. I sighed and told her to go clean herself up while I made breakfast. A tiny bit of hope appeared in her eyes as I set a bowl of shrimp pasta down on the dining table. She quickly took a bite with her fork, but as soon as the food hit her mouth, she reacted badly. Her face twisted in disgust, and she immediately spat the food out. I asked if there was something wrong with it or if it was undercooked. I asked if it was too salty and tried to bite myself. It tasted great to me, perfectly tender and flavorful. I told her she didn't have to ruin the meal just because she was angry with me. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered that I had forgotten this as well. She reminded me that she didn't eat shrimp because she had a severe shellfish allergy. She asked if I had truly stopped loving her and if every detail of her life was now meaningless to me. I completely ignored her emotional question and just remarked that having a shellfish allergy must be very difficult for her. Without my memories, I didn't have any of the associated feelings anymore. I felt absolutely no love for her. She wiped the tears away and looked up with a determined expression on her face. She insisted that we go to the hospital because she was convinced they could fix whatever was wrong with me. I didn't have any other plans, and I was interested to see if the doctors would actually find anything unusual. I agreed to go with her. She explained the whole flower pot incident to the physician once we arrived. She was worried that a brain bleed was putting pressure on a nerve and causing my memory loss. We went to a much larger medical facility this time, and they immediately scheduled me for a CT scan. As expected, the results showed that there was absolutely nothing physically wrong with my brain. Olivia leaned against the hallway wall with her head down, looking incredibly let down by the results. I was distracted by a single question. I couldn't remember how I had ended up getting hit by a flower pot in the first place. According to her, it had just happened, but my memory was clearly deteriorating more rapidly than I thought. The fact that I was forgetting things that had happened just days ago proved that this consciousness transfer was a complicated process. I had been quiet for such a long time that she finally asked me what was on my mind. I asked her exactly when the flower pot incident had occurred without even thinking about how that sounded. She looked at me in disbelief and pointed out that earlier I had only claimed to forget the act of saving her. She asked how I could have forgotten the entire event now. I immediately knew I had made a slip up. I tried to cover it up by saying that I had a lot on my plate and must have just gotten my facts confused. It was a pathetic excuse since my life was currently empty, and I regretted saying it as soon as the words left my mouth. But Olivia didn't actually know anything about my professional life, or really anything about who I was as a person. She just gave a thoughtful nod and told me she was heading to the office since I seemed to be doing okay. I told her to go ahead and wave goodbye. She had no idea that I had already begun taking apart my home studio in secret. I was just waiting until I left to officially announce that I was closing down. I realized I had never really explored the city on my own. I decided to take the chance to wander around and eventually lost all track of time until the sun went down. I got some food from a street vendor and took a slow walk back home. I noticed the lights were already on in the living room. Olivia's eyes were bloodshot and she looked frantic. She ran to the door as soon as I walked inside. She demanded to know where I had been and why I was so late, saying she was just about to come looking for me. I asked her if she needed anything from me, then quickly added that she could always just call Caleb if she did. She snapped that she shouldn't have to call him because I was her husband, reaching out to grab my hand. I gently pulled my hand away and reminded her that she had Caleb listed as her primary emergency contact. I pointed out that they must be quite close since he was the one who had brought her home from the club just the night before. She looked incredibly uncomfortable and claimed that the emergency contact thing was just an old joke from years ago. She said she had simply forgotten to update it and offered to change it to my number right then and there. I stopped her from pulling out her phone and told her not to bother, adding that she shouldn't feel the need to contact me even in an emergency. I realized I sounded a bit too cold, so I softened my voice and said she should have a backup in case I was unavailable. I told her I didn't want to be the reason she couldn't get help quickly. She didn't seem to be listening to a word I said. She threw her arms around me and held me as tight as she could, telling me how much she had missed me and thought about me all day. She swore she loved me and insisted that anything involving Caleb was behind her. She suggested that since I lost my memory, we should both just forget the past. She asked if we could start fresh. I told her that memories don't just go away because you want them to, and told her to stop lying to herself. I told her it was a waste of time. I tried to move her away, but her grip was surprisingly powerful in her frantic state. She was on the verge of tears as she begged me not to act this way and swore that she had no feelings for Caleb. She asked me why I couldn't believe her love after all this time and promised that she would never speak to him again. I shook my head and told her it wasn't necessary because I no longer care what they did together. I told her she didn't need to worry about my feelings at all. I truly was indifferent. She started to sniffle and cry. I pulled away from her reflexively and saw that her face was covered in tears. I was just glad her tears hadn't gotten on my clothes. I must have looked visibly disgusted because she looked even more hurt. She looked devastated and kept repeating that it was impossible for things to have turned out this way. She started screaming for me to come back to her face a messy disaster of tears. I felt a wave of nausea and quickly stepped back. She tried to wipe her face clean. She told me not to worry and that she would find a way to fix me. Then she suddenly ran out of the house into the darkness. I had no clue what she was up to. I had already forgotten so much over the last few days. I went into the study and found a journal in one of the drawers. The unsigned divorce papers were sitting right on top of it. I slapped my hand against my forehead, wondering how I could have possibly forgotten about the divorce agreement. I set the divorce papers on a nightstand and slid the journal under my pillow before going to sleep. I woke up the next morning to find Olivia crouching beside the bed, watching me with a very unsettling look in her eyes. She reminded me that the doctor said my memory loss was caused by a shock and suggested that removing the source of that shock might help. She claimed I would recover if she did. For a second, I thought she was talking about leaving my life for good. Instead, she gave a signal, and two massive bodyguards dragged a struggling Caleb Winters into the bedroom. Caleb was furious and demanded to know what she was doing, calling her insane for treating him this way. She didn't even acknowledge him. She just walked over and slapped him across the face twice as hard as she could. The sound of the slaps echoed in the room. His head snapped back and a bright red mark appeared on his face. He rubbed his jaw and let out a sharp, bitter laugh, asking if this was some kind of new fetish of hers. He mocked her for being so aggressive in front of me, saying he never realized her obsession with him went this far. He was clearly trying to get a reaction out of her because he couldn't handle the idea that she might be over him. He was about to get a very rude awakening. Olivia suddenly kicked him with incredible force. I had never seen her act with that kind of violence before. She grabbed him by the collar and demanded that he speak. She ordered him to admit that there was nothing between them and that she was only his employer. Caleb refused to say a word. He glared at me with a look of pure loathing. I was already tired of watching this dramatic display. I looked away and noticed the corner of my journal sticking out from beneath my pillow. It was right next to the divorce papers. I grabbed the book and held it close to me. I reached out and handed the divorce papers to Olivia, telling her to end the theatrics. I told her to just sign the documents, so she could be free to do whatever she wanted. She began to shake the moment she realized what I was handing her. She screamed that she wouldn't sign them and slapped the papers out of my hand with a violent motion. The force of her move caught me by surprise, causing me to stumble back and drop my journal on the floor. Of course, it landed face up, perfectly open to the very last page I had written in. It was the page where I had recorded everything Caleb said to me on the night he brought her home drunk. She spotted the text immediately. She grabbed the journal and began to read, her expression quickly turning into a mask of pure fury. She lunged at Caleb and began hitting him again without stopping, screaming that everything was his fault. She blamed his big mouth for being the reason I had lost my memory of our life together. Each time she made an accusation, she hit him again. Caleb finally stopped laughing and his eyes went cold and hard. He shouted back that it was her fault for never leaving him alone, even after he told her he didn't love her. He told her she had clung to him like a desperate animal, and that she was the one who deserved all of this. Olivia's face lost all its color. She backed away with her hands shaking, seemingly unable to strike him again. She signaled to her bodyguards, and they began to beat him. The situation quickly turned into a bloody and violent mess. I thought about telling her to call them off, but she was looking at me with a desperate, hopeful expression. She looked like she was waiting for a pat on the back, claiming that no one would treat a person they actually love that way. She asked if I finally believed her. She seemed completely unhinged. Caleb was lying on the floor, battered and bruised. Even in that state, he wouldn't stop talking. He asked me if I really believed that she loved me. He said she was only upset because I wasn't acting like her servant anymore and that it was just her ego talking. He laughed and said she was only using him to try and get some kind of emotional response out of me. He realized that since I didn't love her anymore, I didn't care what happened to him either. Olivia went to hit him again, but I reached out and caught her wrist, telling her that was enough. I told her that Caleb was right. Her being with him didn't hurt me, and her hurting him didn't make me feel any better. I made it clear that my memory loss had nothing to do with either of them and told her to let it go. Olivia covered her ears with her hands and began shaking her head back and forth as if trying to block me out. She started screaming that it wasn't true and that I still loved her. She bolted out of the room like she had lost her mind. I knew there was no way she was going to sign the divorce papers in that condition. I let out a sigh and gathered the papers, deciding to try again another day. My assistant called me, sounding incredibly excited, and asked if I had seen the news. He told me that a bunch of scandalous information about Caleb Winters had been leaked, and his record label had already dropped him and filed a lawsuit. He said Caleb's career was over before it ever really began, and that the guy was completely done for. I knew right away that Olivia was behind it. There was no way a newcomer like him would make national headlines without a major push. It took a lot of power to ruin someone that fast, but I just didn't care about it anymore. I could feel my memories fading even faster now. It was clear that Olivia had no intention of letting go. She took me to all the places we had ever been, desperately trying to jog my memory of our time together. I just went along with it, as if I were a tourist on a guided tour. Eventually, we ended up at a local park. She pointed toward a massive fountain and told me that was the spot where I had proposed to her. She had a look of pure nostalgia on her face as she remembered the moment. I looked over and saw a crowd gathered around a young couple. It looked like another proposal was happening right then. The man shouted out his love for a woman named Chloe Hayes and asked her to marry him. His voice echoed throughout the park, followed immediately by a loud cheer from the onlookers. I heard the woman reply with an enthusiastic yes to a man named Ryan Miller. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted someone familiar hiding behind one of the trees. Olivia's face immediately darkened when she noticed where I was looking. It was Caleb. I realized instantly that the woman getting engaged was Chloe, his first love. She was the protagonist of the original world, and it was clear she had moved on with a new boyfriend. She hadn't been back in the country for very long, yet she was already getting married to someone else. It made sense now why Caleb was so miserable. The woman he truly loved was starting a life with another man. Caleb saw us and tried to leave, but Olivia grabbed my arm and pulled me right toward him. She mockingly pointed out the proposal and told him he looked like a pathetic beaten dog. She called him pathetic and asked him who the real loser was now. She made a point of linking her arm with mine and leaning into me to put on a fake display of marital bliss. Caleb's face remained emotionless as he told her that her acting was absolutely terrible. She didn't seem bothered by his comment at all. She let go of my arm and looked at him with pure contempt. She told him that even a fake performance was better than his reality, since he had nothing and would never be with Chloe. She gave him a triumphant smile. I saw Caleb's jaw tighten and his hands ball into fists. He screamed that it was all her fault and suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Olivia by the throat. He yelled that if he couldn't have love, she should just die. Olivia struggled and looked at me with eyes that were begging for help. As my mind continued to detach from this world, my physical body was becoming more and more frail. Caleb was completely out of his mind and clearly stronger than I was. A direct fight would have been useless. To be honest, I felt a strange sense of detachment from both of them at that moment. I found myself wondering if it really mattered to me if they ended up destroying each other. I watched the scene unfold with cold indifference, though I still had enough of a conscience to know I should do something. I took out my phone and calmly called 911. Olivia's face shifted from panic to total despair as she watched me. Just as she seemed to lose her strength, the crowd nearby let out one last massive cheer for the happy couple. The onlookers swarmed the newly engaged couple, and they all started walking away into the distance. I let out a sigh, thinking that such a beautiful day shouldn't be ruined by the ugliness of these two people. I landed a solid punch on Caleb. He wasn't expecting it and finally let go of her throat. Olivia fell to the ground, gasping for breath and holding her neck. She looked at me and claimed she knew I still loved her. I shook my head and told her that I only did it because I didn't want them to ruin the peaceful atmosphere. I pointed toward the celebratory crowd in the distance. The hope in her eyes instantly vanished. She wore a grimace that looked more painful than a sob. Caleb growled at me, calling me just as much of a loser as Olivia was. He snarled that she treated me like garbage, yet I was still there playing the hero for her. He told me I should have let him finish her off and ordered me to get out of the way, promising not to hurt me. The sound of police sirens grew louder in the distance. Caleb started to panic. He tried to make a break for it, but the officers were on him in seconds and wrestled him to the ground. His face was twisted with fury as he screamed for them to let him go, vowing to kill Olivia so they could die together. Olivia cowered behind my back, even going so far as to mock him while he was being restrained. But a moment later, Caleb managed to tear one of his arms free from the officer's grip. He pulled a pocket knife out and lunged forward. Olivia reflexively stepped back to avoid him. Since he couldn't reach her, he turned the knife toward me and struck. Olivia screamed for me to get out of the way, calling Caleb a psychopath and wishing for him to rot in hell. The police finally got him under control and cuffed him, ensuring he couldn't get away this time. I collapsed onto the pavement. The next thing I heard was someone asking for my invitation. I handed my card to the worker at the entrance. The gold embossed invitation had the name Lucas Croft printed on it. Right below my name, it listed my title as an award-winning composer. Quite a bit of time had passed since I woke up in my actual body. I had spent months in physical therapy. I was finally starting to reclaim my old life. Someone I knew from the industry walked up to greet me. He told me how good it was to see me and remarked on how well I had recovered from my coma. He asked if this meant I was finally making a return to the music scene. I just smiled and gave him a nod. I thanked him for the kind words and confirmed that was exactly what I was planning to do. However, the transfer process had left some holes in my memory. Ever since I regained consciousness, I had been feeling a strange emotional emptiness, and I felt like my music was missing its soul. I thought this gala might be a good place to find some inspiration since these events were always full of rumors and stories. People were grouped together throughout the room, and I could overhear bits of their conversations as I walked by. I grabbed a glass of champagne and positioned myself nearby so I could listen in. I heard someone ask if the others had heard about Olivia Vance being secretly married for years. One person called it old news, but another insisted that the real story was the identity of her husband. They explained that it was a man named Lucas Croft, and he had been killed by Caleb Winters while trying to protect her. They remembered Caleb as that good-looking scholarship student from USC that Olivia used to be obsessed with. They mocked how a wealthy Vance heiress had humiliated herself for a man who didn't even care about her. They said that after her husband died, Olivia had a complete mental breakdown and stopped running her business. Apparently, she just stays home all day now, holding on to his funeral urn. They pointed out the irony that she ignored him for another man while he was alive, only to act like a grieving widow. I found the whole story quite interesting. I figured an heiress like Olivia Vance just couldn't help but be dramatic about everything. Suddenly, a stabbing pain shot through my head and a massive wave of memories came flooding back. I realized that the memory transfer had simply been delayed. All those lost moments began playing in my head like a movie. My old feelings came back with the news. Once the process finished, I took a long, steady breath. The emptiness I had been feeling was finally gone. I felt whole again, but the intense love I once had for her was totally gone. Based on the gossip, Olivia's mental health had deteriorated so much that her family was planning to put her in a private sanitarium. Caleb Winters had been found guilty of murder and was currently on death row. It seemed the original protagonists of that world had both reached a very dark and miserable conclusion to their stories. Only the actual heroine of the story had managed to find real happiness. I realized that a classic romance narrative apparently couldn't function properly without a villain to cause trouble. I was suddenly struck by a wave of inspiration. I went home immediately and spent the entire night writing music. I attended the premiere of my new work and sat right in the front row. The man on stage looked very familiar to me. When Chloe Hayes ran onto the stage with a bunch of flowers for her, I finally figured out who he was. It was Ryan Miller, the man she had married in the park. It was an incredible coincidence. The crowd began to chant my name. A bright spotlight suddenly found me in the front row. I stood up and gave the audience a respectful bow to acknowledge their applause. As I was leaving the venue, I was suddenly confronted by Olivia. It was Olivia. Her hair was a mess, and she had become dangerously pretty. She looked absolutely awful, but her eyes were shining with a kind of desperate, frantic hope that was hard to look at. She whispered my old name, her voice shaking with emotion as she asked if it was real. I gave her a polite, distant smile and told her she must have been confused with someone else. She insisted she wasn't wrong, claiming that I had smiled at her in that exact same way when we first met years ago. She noted how I was being polite but distant and pointed out that both Ethan and Lucas were famous songwriters. She argued that it couldn't be a coincidence that I had woken up from my coma at the exact moment he had died. Her logic was actually quite sound, but she looked completely manic when she spoke. I just calmly suggested that she might need medical help. As far as Lucas Croft was concerned, the man named Ethan had gone. That version of him was completely finished and buried. He was dead and buried. Olivia just stood there staring at me as if she could see right through me. I didn't look away. Eventually, she just snapped. She grabbed her head and fell to the ground, screaming at the top of her lungs. Several members of the band's family who had been searching for her arrived and quickly carried her away from the scene. I looked up at the night sky and watched the stars twinkling above. My name was Lucas Croft. I had a long life ahead of me, and the future looked brighter than ever. Lucas's mission was to redeem his soul, but he learned a bitter lesson. You cannot grant dignity to someone who craves humiliation. Olivia's instant relapse into her obsession with Caleb proved that 5 years of devotion were no match for a decade of toxic attitude. The beauty of this ending lies in Lucas's strategic exit. By detaching his consciousness and returning to a billionaire reality, he achieved the ultimate closure, indifference. While Olivia is left mourning a ghost and clutching an urn, Lucas is living his best life, proving that the most successful redemption isn't saving someone else, it's saving yourself from a lost cause.